This episode is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to get started making your own podcast. First off, Anchor is totally free. It costs you $0 a month to host your podcast with Anchor, as opposed to $15 or more a month with another hosting service. Second, it has all the tools you need to record, edit, and start publishing a podcast right from your phone or computer. If you have an idea for a podcast, you can get started today with the equipment and skills you have right now, and the platform can grow with you as you learn to develop your craft. Anchor will also handle all the podcast directory listings for you, handling distribution to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other popular platforms like Pocket Casts, Overcast, and Radio Public. Finally, Anchor offers you the ability to start making money from your podcast right away with no minimum listenership requirements. That's a major bonus for independent podcasters like me. So if you have an idea for a podcast but aren't sure how to approach the technical side of things or how to monetize your show, give Anchor a try. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hi, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. This is episode 9. My guest for this week is Jack Jenkins. Jack is a national reporter for Religion News Service and author of the book American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. In this conversation, we talk about the religious left for a change, how it differs from the religious right, the examples of leaders of the religious left, like Reverend William Barber, as well as how the media has adapted its coverage of religious groups since the 2016 election. If you'd like to support the show, please do so by telling people about it, leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, and signing up for a paid subscription to my Substack newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. Listeners can get a 25% off subscription by visiting the link in the show notes. You can also follow me on Twitter at brchastain and on Instagram at brchastain_. Without further ado, let's get to this conversation. My guest today is Jack Jenkins, national reporter for Religion News Services and author of American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I'm glad we were able to connect. This show is primarily focused on the rise of Christian nationalism and white evangelicalism, and both of those are tied to the religious right, but you've written a book about the religious left. So how would you define that term, the religious left?
That is a contentious question.
Yeah.
One of the things I acknowledge in the introduction of the book is that the religious left, that term on its own is actually disputed even by faith leaders who I profile in the book. Interestingly, they dispute it for different reasons. Some people think that it sounds too much like the religious right, and they really kind of have a deep distaste for the way that the religious right has done politics, and others think that the religious left actually has a very specific meaning where it only applies to those who might identify, say, as democratic socialists and affiliate with a kind of contemporary view of the historical term leftism. And even within that, there are these even within those different subgroups, there's actually border disputes about who actually constitutes the left and what constitutes the religious left. But for me, the book takes a catch-all approach to this, where it's anybody who kind of is within and around the Democratic Party and the Progressive Coalition could belong potentially to the religious left. But at a practical level, I kind of think of the religious left as a coalition of coalitions. It isn't as uniformly and simplistically, relatively speaking, structured as you might find on the religious right, where you kind of have a few different organizations and a few different leaders who historically have exacted a great degree of power in those sectors. And the religious left is this more ephemeral group where leaders kind of pop up at different times, and there's a lot of different sub communities that are very tailored to specific issues that affect different groups, who then at certain moments in American history, move together. And I should note that my book is really kind of focused on the last 20 years of the religious left, not the religious left that existed, say, in the mid 20th century. One of the classic things people point to is, the civil rights movement, or in the early 20th century when you had things like the social gospel movement or the abolitionist movement, what have you. This is really the last 20 years that I'm chronicling. And I should I'll finish by noting that the thing about the religious left, like I said, it's a coalition of coalitions, but it exists within the modern left, which, unlike previous versions of that in American history, is itself a coalition of coalitions. So there's a high level of complexity and diversity and variability when chronicling this community compared to, say, reporting on the religious right.
Right. Do you see historical ties to these other prior movements? One of the things that has become such a topic of interest is trying to catalog and connect things on the religious right, tracing things back to the formation of the moral majority, and then further back to things like reactions to the Scopes monkey trial. Like, all of those things have sort of been teased out on the side of the religious right, which we all have sort of a mental image of, those of us who are familiar with these things. Did you find any of those connections that bring things back to the social gospel movement, as you mentioned, around in the progressive era rather, and other parts of American political history?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to go really far back to the social gospel movement, I mean, that still has a direct impact on many aspects of the religious left, particularly Christian elements of the religious left. For listeners who are unfamiliar, the social gospel movement of the early 20th century, there was a group of faith leaders, chief among them Walter Rauschenbusch, but there were others who, kind of as a response to the Industrial Revolution, kind of noted that there was a lot of problems that were created by the Industrial Revolution, and also kind of developed this theology that really talked about sin, not just as a thing that happens individually, but also structurally, that there can be structural or communal sin, and kind of talking about how society can participate in sinful activities. And so, and they had a particular concern for the poor and the working poor during that period. The social gospel movement actually ended up is credited by many historians with creating the progressive movement in general, not just the religious progressive movement, but the progressive movement. And it informed deeply FDR's New Deal. In fact, he had members of his administration who advised him in the creation of the New Deal who were avowed social gospelers, as it were. Social gospel also had a deep impact on the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King himself kind of identified as a social gospeler, and you will still hear leaders in the contemporary religious left, such as William Barber, invoke Rauschenbusch and others in their sermons today. It is also true, speaking of the civil rights movement, so many of these activists will point to that as an exemplar, kind of the effectiveness of activism. And it's worth noting that the religious left, arguably significantly more so than the religious right, one of its tools of influencing power is the power of protest. And I bring that up because often on the religious right, you'll find that there are two major mechanisms of influencing power at the ballot box, where white evangelical Protestants in particular tend to vote disproportionately high compared to what chunk of society they actually represent. And they also exact a lot of power at the courts. The thing about that is that those are levers of power that have not always been accessible to millions of Americans, particularly people of color, particularly disenfranchised communities, many of which are represented by leaders within the religious left. And so protest is a tool that these communities often can wield in those moments. And so just as Martin Luther King made great use of protest as a mechanism for helping legislation passed and influencing the powerful, so too do modern religious left activists such as William Barber, who staged the Moral Mondays movement, where there were mass protests in North Carolina, or Linda Sarsour, who was one of the 4 original co-chairs of the Women's March, which was one of the largest single-day protests in American history, and all of these different leaders became very important in the resistance movement after Trump was elected, being rock stars within the progressive left in general because of how closely tied they were to activism. And then even more contemporary historical ties, one of the big movements I chronicle in the book is the New Sanctuary movement, where churches and synagogues and mosques take in undocumented immigrants at risk of deportation and allow them to live in their houses of worship, basically in direct defiance of the federal government. The reason it's called the New Sanctuary movement is it's actually a direct homage to one that happened in the 1980s. And when a similar group of faith groups took in churches and mosques, took in immigrants who were fleeing Central America, primarily fleeing violence there, and welcoming them in their churches, and people even got indicted for doing that. And so, again, you see these historical ties over and over and over again in a lot of these communities. Although, again, it's a little more complex because the modern religious left isn't just Christian. It's very intentionally and overtly multi-faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a lot of other flavors in there as well that don't tie directly to, say, Walter Rauschenbusch's very Christian theology, as it were.
And something you chronicle very well in the book is the coalition building, and that the religious right is seen as sort of always being in lockstep with one another. There are a handful of very influential organizations and individuals that can set the agenda, and then they sort of work towards that. This is a very different approach. Could you talk and elaborate a little bit on how that works within all these different coalitions, as you've mentioned, and how they work inclusive of progressive Christian groups?
Right. So, one of the things that has emerged over the last, kind of couple of decades in particular is that so many subsets of the religious left have often been kind of fighting their own battles, right? So LGBTQ Christians who've been advocating for LGBTQ equality, both in society and also within their own religious traditions, often are their own kind of sub-religious community. And then, of course, there are Muslim Americans who've been advocating for religious equality, both in the legal framework and in the cultural framework for quite some time, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11. You have indigenous and Native American activists who have been actually unapologetic about the religious fueling of their demonstrations. I mean, Standing Rock, for instance, was called a prayer camp, even though it wasn't necessarily covered as such. These are communities that have been doing their own activism for quite some time. And one thing that started to develop, and again, this was true across the left, but also within the religious left, is this understanding of, what affects one indirectly and what affects one directly might affect all indirectly, to kind of invoke a King quote or homage there, which is that, these groups started saying, hey, if we show up together, we can have a bigger impact. And a classic example of that was Reverend William Barber's Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, where essentially he performed what he refers to as fusion organizing, which is getting a lot of disparate groups, people from different faiths and different issue areas to show up in the same space. Now, what's important to note about that is that organizing and that sort of thing happens irrespective of what's happening in politics. People just find coalitions and forge coalitions out of necessity or just, out of common cause. But when in the Moral Mondays movement was in reaction to the election of a disproportionately conservative state legislator in that state, and that kind of created this sort of existential crisis for a lot of people who either might identify as deeply progressive or just vaguely progressive or liberal, more moderate. All were really offended by the election of the state legislator, and so it allowed for this broad-based coalition to start working together. And there's a point in my book where I note that that coalition was successful on election night 2016. They are credited with helping unseat the Republican governor of North Carolina. But of course, the other big thing about November 2016 was the election of Donald Trump. And the next morning, William Barber called one of his associates and said, America is North Carolina now. And what he meant by that is that Trump's election also kind of manifested this sort of existential crisis for a lot of progressive groups and religious progressive groups. And so you started seeing this very quick coalition building happen across faith communities. You saw historic alliances between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish groups in particular happen very quickly. Many of whom experienced violence in their or threats of violence at their houses of worship, or because of their faith, they started forming these coalitions to kind of push back against that religious bigotry. And those, kind of coalitions of necessity led to wider organizing efforts where they said, hey, we went to that press conference together to say, don't issue these death threats against the synagogue or this mosque. We also want to talk about having the sanctuary conversations. Could you come to that on Tuesday at our church or at our synagogue? And kind of discuss that sort of topic. And so as this continued, you started to see this broad coalition start to emerge, again, in broad opposition to Trump in general and their specific issue concerns in particular. And to the point where I think one of the things I point out in one of the chapters kind of talking about the multi-faith aspect of the religious left is that so many of these faith leaders end up having really difficult conversations about touchy topics before the broader left does. So a classic example of that is Israel-Palestine. And I kind of chronicle a little bit of how before that became a flashpoint, even within the Democratic Party, in the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of these religious left leaders were having hard conversations about that topic, not necessarily solving it or drawing firm conclusions, but at least establishing forms of dialogue and terms of engagement for that kind of a dialogue that, were called upon when the party suddenly encountered those same issues at a national stage a few years ago. Again, if that makes any sense. And so the religious left has played this interesting role of both being, one of the core mechanisms of activism and one of the core bridge builders during the course of Trump's presidency, because they have been so successful at building many of these coalitions at the local and national level.
Yeah, and in that way they've acted as a sort of vanguard, even though now I've been watching that documentary about the vow about Nexium. So that term evokes something else very specific to this particular moment, but the general term of the word being, a sort of not a standard bearer, but the person that goes before. So the religious left has function in that regard as well for the overall left. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the example of Reverend Barber in particular. He does feature in your book quite a bit as an example of this new might not be the right word, but a contemporary example of this type of leader on the religious left. You've already talked about some of the things he's done, but could you mention some things regarding his biography and why and how he's been so successful at developing these sorts of strategies and these coalitions?
Yeah, I mean, Barber's a fascinating figure for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, he comes out of the American South. He's from North Carolina. He's actually deeply concerned about the South in general. Often when I interview him, he talks about how the South often gets left out of conversations about, progressive conversations, despite the fact, he points out as a Black pastor that, the sizable chunk of the African-American population in the country lives in the Deep South. And, a sizable percentage of those who are affected by issues of poverty, for instance, or environmental devastation happen in these states that the progressives don't talk about as often, or at least don't talk about in terms of winning in a electoral sense. And so, he's this pastor out of North Carolina who, really, ran the NAACP there, but really kind of burst onto the national stage because of that Moral Monday movement that I mentioned. And I'll note that a big part of the success about that movement was the kind of poetry of protest that it brought to the fore. It was very intentionally set up so that every Monday there was a protest in the Capitol, and that every Monday there would be arrests that happened at that Capitol. And that would include, both faith leaders, but also, people who are suffering from medical maladies, who would have to be wheeled out, or like older grandmothers, people who kind of represented the concerns that they were trying to bring up and highlight as part of their protest. And then they were end up, being joined by thousands of, protesters who wanted to kind of participate, at least as a rally style event around those things. And so, in 2013, the largest liberal protest in general was in North Carolina for the country in as part of the Moral Mondays movement. So fast forward to 2016, he ended up, because of how much notoriety or how much attention he got, because of that, he spoke at the Democratic National Convention, gave this sermon-like speech that in prime time at that DNC that garnered a massive standing ovation. But I think what's been interesting about him in the Trump era is that there was a transition that was happening for him around that same time, which was that he was launching along with Reverend Liz Theo Harris. He was relaunching the last campaign of Martin Luther King, which was called the Poor People's Campaign, which is focused on the concerns of the poor, irrespective of race, but also including the element of race as a component of the critique of our economic system.
Mm-hmm.
And that campaign is a big one. It is not something that is as easy or as strategic as, this one housing policy, for instance, in one city, or, this one approach to immigration reform or something like that. It is a myriad of topics that are underneath that umbrella of poverty. And they have, at their events, they often kind of talk about 5 great sins of America, and one of them actually is religious nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
They bring up as something they specifically decry and are reacting against. And what that has meant is there have actually been broad-based More People's Campaigns demonstrations across the country for a myriad of things. And while that hasn't gotten as much attention or exposure, it has started to kind of build these communities of activists and demonstrators, many of whom are faith-based, in cities and towns across the country. And I think their long game there is to try to change the conversation about policy. And they've been successful at some level. I mean, it's worth noting that when Barber last summer, he went to D.C. for 2 weeks. And during that time period, and I chronicle a lot of this in the book, he held this protest outside the White House, for one, and hundreds of faith leaders came,
Mm-hmm.
and I was down there to cover it. And I turned around while I was waiting for them to arrive in Lafayette Park, right outside the White House, and there was Pete Buttigieg, who had just showed up, who was running for president at the time. And unlike how the interactions you often see between politicians and members and leaders of the religious right, Pete Buttigieg didn't say anything at that event. He just stood with the crowd quietly. And the best photo op he got out of that was sitting on a curb at William Barber's feet, which is a different visual juxtaposition than you find in a lot of, religious right contexts where, the president will, literally get on stage and in front of the congregation, et cetera, et cetera. But even more interesting was the next week when Barber held a candidates forum, and 9 candidates came, and it was supposed to be 10. Julian Castro missed his flight. And that included Kamala Harris, that included Elizabeth Warren, that included Bernie Sanders, and it included Joe Biden. And so, and they got them all to kind of promise to, at least pitch for, a poverty-specific debate within the party, which didn't happen because they don't control the Democratic Party. But you even saw Joe Biden return to one of their events in the last couple of months and did a virtual address to the Poor People's Campaign. And, that's a level of clout that most activists would really dream of having, is the ability
absolutely.
to really have the ear of a presidential candidate more than once. And Biden actually referenced his previous visit to that presidential candidates forum in his remarks to this virtual Poor People's Campaign event. And it's also worth noting that Barber also played a significant role in opposition to the appeal to the attempt by Republicans to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. He was on the Hill quite a bit. If he wasn't getting arrested himself, he was near people who were getting arrested. And so he's just become this interesting figure that is a kind of a progressive rock star in general. But he, and I mean that he has kind of been a crossover hit for the religious left, as it were, where he's recognized regardless of whether someone's going to church on Sunday or worship any other day of the week. But he is still rooted deeply in that progressive faith community, and that's where he drew a lot of his strength.
That's really fascinating, and I think he's such a powerful person to be working in this political arena. I want to transition actually back to sort of people who may come from an evangelical background or people that are still within evangelicalism. A lot of people aren't even aware of this whole other part of American religious and political history because of the way in which American history or politics has been framed for them. Is that something that you've come across either as a reporter or on your own, of people being sort of surprised to see the depth of examples of this type of political activism that is actually driven by a religious impulse that it isn't tied to something that the religious right may want someone, a potential voter, to pursue.
Yeah, it's actually been an interesting reaction to my book that I've heard a few times of people being
Mm-hmm.
like, I had no idea. And I'll note on a historical point, one thing that's interesting about the religious left, if you really want to make it a century, and century and a little bit more than that of history here. I mean, the development of the religious right, as we understand it today, is in many ways a reaction to the success of liberal Christianity in the early 20th century. And people forget the liberal Christianity basically won the first half of the 20th century in a very real way. And the development of fundamentalism, the fundamentalists, was in reaction to liberal Christianity and in part the social gospel. And when they continued to lose in the public square, there was a bit, historians would correct me for making it this simplistic, but there was a bit of a retreat from the Republic sphere by these fundamentalists who later rebranded themselves as evangelicals after a successive series of defeats in the public square in the early 20th century. And whereas the religious left, quote unquote, or at least liberal Christianity at that time, continued to kind of wane in terms of its
Mm-hmm.
power. Like it didn't have to create new institutions. Most of the institutions that were created already knew the liberal Christians. They didn't have to make their own news stations. Just whatever news station existed already took their faith for granted. Whereas white evangelicals went and created their own schools, their own publishing houses, their own radio
Mm-hmm.
shows, and their own television stations. So by the time they really came back into the fore in the political square in the 80s and the 90s, they came with an apparatus that the religious left couldn't match and didn't see coming because they had created their own media world in that regard. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's been interesting to kind of see this because one of the tacks that the religious right has taken really since from the 80s and into the current day is actually repeating some of the arguments they made against liberal Christians in the social gospel back in like 1910, 1920. They were almost repeating them verbatim, accusing them of being, these capitulating to society, as it were, which runs under the assumption that the society wasn't, in many ways crafted by liberal Christianity to begin with. But I say all that because, the more recent tact has just been to pretend that the religious left doesn't exist at all, that the religious right has had this, really strong grasp of what it means to be religious in public, and those who are not like them are not adequately religious. So they fuse
Mm-hmm.
those 1920s era arguments with 1990s level era culture wars, to the point where a lot of this activism that we talk about in the religious left just went unrecognized. And that narrative that the religious right put forward was very successful at impacting the media as well, to the point where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this religious left activism was seen to be anemic or not as effective, despite the fact that, as one of I chronicle in the book, the Affordable Care Act, arguably one of the most landmark pieces of liberal legislation in a century, was passed only with the help of Catholic nuns. And that's not me saying that. Barack Obama said
Mm-hmm.
that. And so, it's one of those things where these stories go untold because in the public square, the religious right really won the war when it comes to the term religion. And so people just don't know that these communities exist. I will note that I've also run into several times of people just accusing these communities of not actually being religious, quote unquote, despite the fact that they go to worship or they go to church or whatever once a week or once a month, what have you.
Right.
There's this idea, this theological critique that they're not adequately religious or that they worship the state or something to that effect, which again doesn't hold up historically when you look at this kind of activism going back, a century or even deeper than that.
Right. Actually, I'd love for you to elaborate on, because you do profile a Catholic nun who becomes an activist for healthcare
Mm-hmm.
because of the nature of things in the current news cycle in regards to like Amy Coney Barrett in
Right.
particular and her nomination. Conservative Catholicism is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. However, this was a strong example of someone else who espouses that same faith but comes to very different social beliefs and activism. So could you elaborate on that particular? I'm sorry, I don't have her name in front of me. So
No,
please
it's
help me
okay.
out here.
There's a couple of them, so it's all right.
Yeah.
Well, no, one thing I should point out is that one thing that people often forget is the reality of American Catholicism is that it leans liberal in polling.
Mm.
Most Catholics support same-sex marriage, actually higher percentages of Catholics than a lot of other religious groups, despite the position of the church. You also see a lot of support for immigrants, refugees within these communities. American Catholicism as a group actually undoubtedly skews liberal on most issues, or on a lot of the hot button issues in polling. You actually see majority support, even when polls are conducted by conservative Catholic groups. A bare majority of Catholics actually also believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And I say all that to kind of set the tone for the fact that one thing that people have come to notice is that, in part as a result of the sex abuse scandal, that broke in the early 2000s within the church,
Mm-hmm.
and partially perhaps for other reasons, Catholic nuns poll a lot higher, or at least significantly higher than Catholic bishops. So while
Mm-hmm.
bishops certainly enjoy more power within the Catholic Church than Catholic nuns, they don't enjoy as much political or at least popularity as nuns do, and that means something different when we're talking about American politics, where that kind of popularity can make a difference. And that all brings me back to the Affordable Care Act, which is that there was a nun by the name of Sister Carol Keehan who was running the Catholic Health Association at the time, who, when Barack Obama started running for president, she was initially unimpressed with his healthcare acumen at the time, and then he worked on it.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time he became president, she became deeply involved in crafting and advocating for the Affordable Care Act, and eventually she published in her kind of niche publication that's run underneath the Catholic Health Association that she was going to support the Affordable Care Act, which to anyone who knew her was not at all surprising, because she'd been involved in advising the administration on terms of how to craft it. The issue was that the Catholic bishops came out against the Affordable Care Act,
Mm.
arguing that that it could lead to potential, among other things, arguing that it could lead to state-funded abortions and things like that, which was refuted by any number of people, but that ended up being part of the argument that the bishops made. But instead of backing down, another group of nuns, members with the LCWR, which is this kind of more umbrella organization of Catholic nuns here in the United States, around 55,000 Catholic nuns, leaders within that group came out and endorsed with Sister Carol Keehan, say that they too would like to back the Affordable Care Act. And chief among them was Sister Simone Campbell, who runs a Catholic social justice lobby named Network, and proved to be this very effective advocate. And this gave a lot of Catholic Democrats who were a little concerned after the Catholic bishops came out against the bill, that they were concerned about supporting it because what that might mean back home. But once they heard the endorsement of the nuns, they said, well, now we've got cover, because people like nuns more anyway. And so that ended up proving a very effective political tool. And it was so effective to the point where when one, on the day when the House voted on the vote, actually John Podesta, founder of the Center for American Progress and also worked in the White House with both Clinton and Obama, he was in Rome for something else and hanging out with Sister Carol Keehan, who was calling members of Congress who were Catholic on her cell phone to try to convince them to vote for the bill. And also when the signing ceremony happened, Sister Simone Campbell was up on the rope line right there and invited to be part of the signing ceremony. And Obama actually kept one of the pens that he signed that Affordable Care Act with for Sister Carol Keehan of the Catholic Health Association. Remember, the rest of the pens went to people like Ted Kennedy and like these major healthcare advocates that you may have heard of. But when he gave that pen to Sister Carol Keehan when she got back from the Vatican, and then later appeared at the Catholic Health Association conference to say point blank, we could not have done it without Carol Keehan's help, and implying the help of Catholic nuns in general. And that kind of points to this sort of unsung advocacy that has happened within the religious left. Although it certainly caught the advocacy of the nuns and the ACA caught the attention of the Vatican. And actually, a couple of years later, there was an investigation launched of Catholic nuns, and Network's work in particular was mentioned by name as something the Vatican was going to investigate. And they ended up dropping Pope Francis, because that was under Pope Benedict. Pope Francis ended up dropping that investigation eventually. But it goes to show you that this is something that they were willing to do, basically, and take the knocks and the mea culpas, and issue mea culpas to the church, but it didn't diminish their clout at all. In fact, Sister Simone Campbell told me that the Vatican investigation and the attention that they got for coming out against the bishops only heightened their popularity. And she was able to, a few years later, launch the Nuns on the Bus tour, which was this tour decrying Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan's federal budget proposal. And they toured around the country decrying that. And then she ended up also speaking at the Democratic National Convention in 2012. And like Barber, 4 years later, she also spoke in prime time and also got a standing ovation. Again, these are advocates that if you were in that niche world, you would know how much impact they had, but they just don't get the same attention as, say, a Ralph Reed or previously a Jerry Falwell Jr. might get for the same kind of impact.
Right. I'd love to hear what you think is some of the banner stories to come out of this particular presidential campaign. I mean, there's so many things to cover. There's the downfall of Jerry Falwell Jr., there's the Amy Coney Barrett Supreme Court nomination, there's the religious life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there's the way in which the Democratic Convention was very overtly religious, and the way in which, of course, religion has been used by Trump and his lieutenants, to say that Biden will destroy God somehow. Things like, which is still just such a puzzling thing. But
just theologically, it's a confusing statement.
But I mean, everyone knows that he never actually bothered to learn to speak the language or the theology. However, I know that there's just been so much that's sort of happened. What do you think when we look back and we try to parcel out all the things that have happened in the 2020 presidential election relative to religion and politics? What do you think are some of the standout stories and developments that will stand the test of time?
Well, you've hit several of them, and I applaud you for that. Those are many of the key stories, but they're part of, I think, two significant larger narratives. One of them is kind of the role of religion in this 2020 campaign, going back even to the primary. I mean, I think it's noteworthy that Biden was the first to hire a faith outreach director specifically in the state of South Carolina in August of last year. And by the end of last year, he already had the endorsement of 100 faith leaders just in that state. And when he, I went down there during the primary to do some reporting there, and I remember I walked into his one of his offices in North Charleston. I saw how deeply ingrained faith outreach was into his campaign, because there on the wall was a sign that just said "Preacher's Heart, Joe Biden." And I went into different churches, and it was very clear that Biden's team had done a lot of work with this constituency, and Biden owes in many ways the fact that he became the Democratic candidate to African American voters in general in the state of South Carolina, but particularly African American churchgoers, just because a lot of those churches are very good at voter registration and voter mobilization, and that they just take up a disproportionate percentage of the Democratic Party in that state. And so in many ways, Biden as a nominee owes his status as the nominee to Black churchgoers in a very real way. Because his victory in South Carolina just completely changed the dynamic of the campaign afterwards. And, as you note, he then also has consistently invoked faith throughout the course of his campaign. I mean, one of the taglines of his campaign is "Battle for the Soul of the Nation," which I should note, I did not know that was going to be his campaign slogan when he was added to the subheadings of my book. There was no collusion there. But that's a religious reference. And he, and like you said, in the Democratic National Convention, they had dedicated an entire section to his faith, which we hadn't seen in the past. And he's spoken to multiple different religious groups, and his Catholicism has come up quite a bit. I mean, it's just been part of it is because that's kind of how Biden has run for a long time. Like it's easier for the campaign to invoke it because the candidate has invoked it for quite some time. But it's also noteworthy how big of a part of Democrats it was this year, particularly when compared to 2016. I'll note that Barack Obama also had a very robust faith outreach operation back in 2008 in particular, and arguably had the largest faith outreach operation of any candidate in American history up until that point. But so I think Biden might have taken some cues from his old boss there.
Mm-hmm.
But the 2016 was ridiculed for the 2016 Clinton campaign was ridiculed for a lot of reasons because that's what happens when you lose. But one of the critiques is that they did not do anything close to adequate faith outreach, and it really seems like Biden's team has reversed that this go round. And to be clear, that also includes targeting people who aren't just Christian. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Muslim Americans in Michigan in particular are very valuable demographic to Democrats, because if they turn out in a big way for Democrats, they have such a sizable population just outside of Detroit and Dearborn, Michigan, that could tip the scales. And Trump only barely won that state in 2016. So
Mm.
that, kind of on the Democratic column is how interesting religion has been in terms of it being so infused into Biden's campaign. On the Republican side, it's been really interesting because, Christian nationalism has been such a flashpoint and such a key component of how Trump has built his base. I mean, it's appeal to Christian nationalism as opposed to these specific theological arguments that might have, appealed to more, higher-minded evangelicals, like in the sense that, some of the old leaders of the religious right, Trump kind of bypassed them and went straight to this appeal to to Christian nationalism that was said more about identity than it did theology.
Right.
And that explains, that's why when we saw Trump walk across, Lafayette Square after it was forcibly cleared of demonstrators, and for the record, priests who were working at that church were
Right.
also forcibly cleared, and held up that Bible. I mean, he was standing in front of a church whose priests had been forcibly removed from there, and whose bishop would then yell at him on national television for the next 2 days, who did not want him there and who he wasn't invited to be there. But
Mm-hmm.
his signal wasn't to members of that church, because that's a relatively liberal denomination. It was a signal to his former Christian nationalist base, some of whom celebrated it. So many of his faith advisors thought it was the right thing to do. They told me that when I did reporting on that, for him to make that move and to hold up that Bible. And the real question, though, that we'll find out in less than 2 weeks is whether that did prove to be a very effective way to build a big enough base to get him to victory in 2016. It's unclear if that'll be enough this go round. And that's partially because, there could be waning support for Christian nationalism writ large. It
Mm-hmm.
also could be that, it turns out that Christian nationalism you can't beat a pandemic. And I do think that the pandemic has been one of the greatest threats to Trump's reelection. Is, there's this deep disappointment with how he handled that, to the point where even among white evangelical Christians, in one of the polls I've looked at in the last few weeks, this was like, I think, a couple months ago, actually, you saw like this broad support for Trump in general. But when, in the 60s and like high 60s, early 70s for him. But when you ask that same group if they themselves, or that they knew anyone who had contracted COVID-19, that dropped 9 or 10 points.
Mm.
And so it seems like, despite how powerful of an identity, draw that Christian nationalism can be, it turns out that the impact of the pandemic might be more. And so that I think is the other kind of narrative that Trump is wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
Coming into election day. And again, we might be saying in 2 weeks that, again, it proved to be an effective tactic, that he has cobbled together a group of evangelical leaders who were not paragons of the religious right before he rose to power, but have since enjoyed quite a shift in their status because of their affinity with him and because their willingness to engage in Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see if that's still enough come November.
Right. Yeah, and we're very close. I'm also curious about your experience as a religion reporter, working in a number of different publications. You've also been a commentator in the Netflix series The Family, which focuses on the book written by Jeff Charlotte. And I'm just curious as to how you feel that the American media, in particular, has adapted and evolved their ability to cover stories that are very deeply informed by religion and by groups that have very particular theological beliefs or very particular practices, and how whether you think that they have learned, feel free to be specific where I'm being general, because I know that as a critique is always lobbied against the media as if it's a singular cohesive thing, and it is obviously not, especially now in a world where Facebook and Twitter just atomizes all of our influences and creates lots of many subcultures. Nonetheless, For larger national media, do you think that they have been able to improve their coverage of the religious right and the religious left, and the way in which religiosity informs our politics?
So the unhelpful answer is yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things that we as religion reporters, regardless of where we work, often advocate for. If there's a thing we advocate for, it's for more of us. That
Right.
we think that
Mm-hmm.
newsrooms have done a poor job of continuing to hire religion reporters, and that doesn't mean they have to be religious or be of one particular religious community, but just having a reporter dedicated to these topics,
Mm-hmm.
we think only broadens the comprehension. I mean, one of the things that came out of the 2016 election, there was a lot of mea culpas from the media, which I have a whole nother. I could say a lot of other things about whether or not I think the media needed to mea culpa in the aftermath of that. If you weren't specifically calling the election, I'm not sure you needed to. There was a lot of browbeating. I'm not sure that we needed to do, but I do think I remember it was the editor in chief of the New York Times, I believe, who said that religion was something they felt like they did not get and they did not do an adequate job of
Mm-hmm.
in 2016. They had one religion reporter then, and now they have two national religion reporters. They also have someone who does more metro stuff, and they have dedicated more stories to religion. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that even if someone's not a religion reporter, I do want to say, like talking about the Times, they have expanded that coverage. Whether it's the other problem with the Times is everything they write is deeply criticized because of who they are.
Right.
But I think it's notable that, say the Washington Post, up until recently has had a 3 religion reporter team for years. And they're technically a smaller outlet than the New York Times. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's still true that when you look at these national publications, whether that's MSNBC or CNN or even Fox News, frankly, you're either going to find 1 or 0 people who are dedicated to faith. I mean, when I used to work in my old publication, Think Progress, I was the only, and historically the only religion reporter they ever had, and that was a big percentage of the newsroom because it wasn't a huge newsroom. It was interesting that they dedicated that time. But one thing I often found when I worked there is that I would show up to events and be either one of the only or the only reporter covering something. And then you publish it the next day, and people are like, "Wow, like what a scoop!" And I'm like, these people were advertising this event. They were very clear that this was going to occur. It's just
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't somebody else to compete with. What has changed this last election season, though, is that I'm not the only person making these phone calls. Now, I work at Religion News Service now, a whole publication dedicated to religion news, and that's a very
Mm-hmm.
different space. And we work in partnership with the Associated Press, who has also hired people specifically dedicated to pursuing religion and politics. But I often have to wait in line to talk to people who previously I would thought I was their only phone call, and that to me tells me that there has been this recognition, at least in general, among publications that religion is something you need to take seriously. The religious left is something I've covered quite a bit, and I will say the problem with covering religious left is that it's really hard, and that a lot of the it's not like the religious right where you have a few organizations you can always call that have very efficient, well-paid communication staff. Right, the religious left, by its very nature, is significantly more atomized than that. The
Mm-hmm.
organizations are smaller. You have one person at a nonprofit who does 12 jobs.
Right.
And so it's a harder thing to kind of wrangle, and then you have to have knowledge in multiple faith spaces, which is easier said than done. And I get that for a lot of reporters who don't do this for a living, it's a bigger ask and a bigger lift for them to even do one major feature on this topic. But I have seen them. So I do think you're starting to see a recognition that even if in the general trend of things, we are seeing Americans in general become unaffiliated with religion, which, as you know, doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't religious in some capacity or that they don't believe in God or pray daily, but they aren't attaching themselves to one religious institution. If they aren't attaching themselves to an institution, that means the institutions themselves are getting weaker. Even with that reality, it doesn't change the fact that religion remains a vibrant and a very influential part of American society, and as such, a very vibrant and influential part of American politics. And so, I think that there has absolutely been improvement since 2016 in our field. I have seen, expansions in some directions, and other places where there were expansions, the outlets themselves have gone under, which is not really the fault of the religion reporter.
Right.
But
Right.
I will say that on the other end, I think there is still significantly more work to do. And I think a lot of stories in the last year either fell through the cracks or I think were inadequately covered because there just simply weren't enough people paying attention.
Yeah, I that's great. This is actually not related to your book, but it is related to, I think, something that does have an influence on the election,
Okay.
which is actually the presence of QAnon.
Mm.
I've seen a couple of people. I follow a lot of reporters on Twitter, and a couple of the signals that I've seen is that there are basically like two groups that really sort of saw the potential influence of QAnon and the types of things that were happening within those circles online. And they were tech reporters and religion reporters that were sort of aware of the potential influence of this. And this is not something that's covered in your book. It's not necessarily something related to the religious left. But again, given your role in the media and being one of a select number of reporters that does cover religion exclusively, what has your impression been of the threats that a conspiracy group like QAnon has for the American electorate?
So, I should caveat this for your listeners to say that this is not a topic on which I have reported extensively or much at all. That I have handed off many a story to a couple of my colleagues at Religion News Service who have done more reporting on this. But it doesn't mean it doesn't come across my desk a lot. I mean, we now have reporting indicating that QAnon specifically targets faith communities and religious communities at this point. And to me, given other reporting I've done on some conservative Christian communities in particular, that doesn't strike me as particularly surprising. Not necessarily that these communities, that QAnon would emerge out of those communities, although that certainly could happen. But that it doesn't surprise me that they would be targeted. I mean, we do know that some of these communities have been targeted by misinformation campaigns, irrespective of QAnon, in the past. And if you get certain religious figures to sign on to these sorts of things, they can literally become a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that, if you have, the idea of having secret knowledge, right? That's not new in religious circles. Gnostics of the early Christian era would point us to the fact that that's a very seductive idea, having that sort of secret knowledge. And you go into any number of religious communities. I don't want to caveat this pretty harshly. I don't want to make a one-to-one correlation with these sorts of faith communities I'm about to talk about and QAnon.
That's fine.
I'm just pointing to why they might be targeted, which is that one of the faith communities that has been elevated under Trump into the political sphere in a way that they have not been in the past is charismatic Christians. Even Trump's most trusted faith advisor, Paula White, who now is a White House official, she runs the faith initiative office at the White House. We don't actually know what that position actually means quite yet, but she does technically run that. She is deeply influenced by charismatic Christianity, and you will see evidence of that if you watch her worship services. And just this past Sunday, Trump was at a church in Las Vegas where you could again see evidence of charismatic Christianity. He visited that same church right before the election in 2016 and received a prophecy from the faith leaders there. And again, prophecy in a religious context for these communities means a very specific thing. And I observed and partially attended this, for reporting purposes, this gathering at the Trump International Hotel a couple of years ago, at the tail end of 2018, I believe, where these prayer warriors believed that, made these prophecies regarding the Trump administration. And it was at the Trump International Hotel and talked about how they had met with members of the administration, and they did decry the deep state, that in a prayer prophetic way. And you could see how if you were pushing QAnon, or if you really were a devout believer in QAnon, that these are communities that you already have certain kinds of pieces of language in common. And so you could say, hey, guess what? We also have this piece of information. And so we have seen some overlap from those sorts of communities and, support for QAnon. So, I mean, again, the thing about movements like this is, reporters often struggle because we don't know how much of reporting on it, because this is fascinating, right? It's a fascinating phenomenon. And sometimes as a reporter, you don't want to over report on something and overblow its influence just because it's so interesting. But we also do now have people running for office who are, espoused QAnon believers,
Right.
and so who potentially will occupy, houses, seats in Congress, in come January.
Which is why I felt it was a relevant question.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's why, like, you have to take it seriously. So, as a phenomenon, what exactly QAnon even means anymore is an interesting question. But as a force, again, it does not surprise me at all that communities that are already seem to be aligned in terms of rough critiques or questions about American politics and the deep state and things like that might find common ground at this point in American history.
I do want to close things out with your thoughts on something that is hot off the presses, so to speak, from today. An essay by John Piper that was published onto the Desiring God website. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to read through that. It did begin to make waves. It was trending on Twitter, showing John Piper vaguely signaling that it might be okay to not support Trump for re-election because of character matters, essentially.
Yeah.
Is what that came down to. I am curious how your position as a religion reporter sees those sorts of signals and how they've been influenced by 4 years of the Trump administration, continuous scandals, including those like Jerry Falwell Jr.'s fall from grace and that sort of thing, and the way in which, even though white evangelicals still support Trump to a degree of around 78%, as the most recent figure I saw, there does seem to be at least some flagging enthusiasm amongst some people that might not be interested in voting for him for re-election.
Yeah, so I think there are two parallel interesting stories that I see as emerging at the same time that I think circle around your question. One is that the resilience of white evangelical support for Trump still astounds many religion reporters, and still astounds evangelicals who are both in and outside the support for Trump. Just the rock solidness of that. How often, even in the midst of controversies, that support would continue. I mean, one of the stories, I mentioned this in my book, is that when after Charlottesville, when Trump made the infamous "both sides" remark that was referring to the protesters and counter protesters in Charlottesville, no White House official, when I believe it was CBS or ABC, I can't remember which one, requested that White House officials come on the show to kind of defend the president on this. The White House declined, but instead pointed them to Jerry Falwell Jr. and put him out to defend the president. Again, the White House wouldn't defend itself, but they leaned on a certain cadre of white evangelical leaders to defend them, even in the wake of the family separation policy, which had one of the most uniform religious denunciations of any policy I have ever seen. More so than abortion, more so than like war. Like it was almost uniform. This pushback that I saw, this array of evangelical faith leaders that advises the president. Paula White went and visited one of the camps and then made statements saying it's not that bad for the kids, things like that. Again, these white evangelical Protestants became the defenders, and so I do think there has been one story where people would just say, like, look, there might be some generational changes happening over time in white evangelical Protestantism. There is some signals that, like, younger evangelicals might, even if they might be Republican, they might be differently Republican than their parents. But at least not a Trump Republican. But in general, there's a very solid block of people who seem to be unmoved by Trump's both his clumsiness with regard to scripture. There really does seem to be a power in what Trump has now articulated, a very overtly transactional relationship with this group.
Yeah.
Where particularly the appointment of judges, I mean, he's been very effective at that in a way that he hasn't been very effective at other parts of his policy agenda. He really has delivered on the promises to conservative Christians in general and white evangelicals in particular. However, the reality about that group is that while they did support Trump in record numbers, and will probably we have every assurance, as you noted, that they will probably still support him in very large numbers in the next couple of weeks. The other reality is that it doesn't take much. It doesn't take a whole lot of fracturing in that base to cost him an election. Just 2 or 3 percentage points, or even 1 or 2 percentage points, could cost him entire states. And it's unclear if what we're seeing, in that, John Piper was also critical of Trump around the election and after the election. So it's
Right.
not totally, and I want to point out, Piper did not actually endorse Biden in that piece. He very much was like, kind of, they're both evil, was like kind of or at least there's two evils that are happening around these candidates, and he can't support either. Or at least that's what was suggested without saying anything explicitly.
Yes, I saw it as like a Rorschach test. You sort of saw what you wanted to see.
Exactly. But it certainly wasn't an endorsement of Trump,
Right.
And
Correct.
what I see in that is there has been this one group of white evangelicals who's been deeply critical of Trump. Usually these more, I talk about it in my book, these more kind of intellectual, they're more attached to these certain institutions like Wheaton College, evangelicals like Russell Moore, for instance, who really took issue with Trump, who will continue to take issue with Trump this year. But I do think you're seeing this small fracturing of evangelicals who might actually support basically all the policies that Trump has put forward, or at least the vast majority of them, but who just really had his controversies and, the appeal to Christian nationalism has weighed on them over time. And whether or not they vote for Biden, I think is a bigger question than I think whether or not they'll vote at all. I think there's some suspicion that a lot of these kind of fracturing white evangelicals won't show up on election day, which means they also won't show up on an exit poll. But that could show up, but they will show up they won't show up at the ballot box, which will show up on the returns. And so I think that's a bigger thing to watch. Now, I'll caveat that by saying that I don't even know what election polls are going to look like when such a huge percentage of Americans are voting before election day.
Right.
But I do think that even small movements in that base are a really bad sign for Trump, which is why I think he and his team reacted so strongly to the Christianity Today editorial at the beginning of this past year.
Yep.
That called for his removal from office, because they know that there's not much they need that overwhelming historic support to still give him support to give him a victory on election day if it's going to be as close as 2016, because his margins were so small that go around. And so we'll see. And I do think that it sounds like we have evidence that religious right figures definitely have activated their mobilization machines this go around. They're definitely energized to try to get out that support. And again, this is a demographic who feels rewarded by supporting Trump, even if they don't like him. They really, many of them feel, very strongly in support of his policies. But again, if he loses 1 or 2%, that could spell, the end of his prospects for a second term.
Yeah. Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the religious left, as well as media and Christian nationalism, white evangelicalism, all these stories that you've covered and have some insights into as a national reporter. Jack Jenkins is the national reporter for Religion News Service and author of American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Jack, where can people find you online? Where can they find your book? Anything else you might want to mention here?
Sure. So you can find me online at Twitter at Jack M. Jenkins. My book, you can find it, where all bookstores are sold. You can find it on Amazon and everything else. But in the midst of this pandemic, I do know that local bookstores are suffering. So if you can find, a local bookstore or a place you trust that might be struggling, that's carrying the book, I always support trying to keep those places in business, because quite frankly, that's where I spend a lot of my time.
Right.
Before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage you to do that as well. I will say that it is coming out in paperback early next year. So if you don't need to get it via Kindle or hardback now, it will be coming back around soon in paperback. And other than that, just, Twitter really is the best place to find me, which I regret anybody having to go onto that website, but that is in fact where a lot of the news happens.
That's right. Yeah. And on the independent bookstore note, you can find a link. You'll find a link to his book on bookshop.org, which can connect you with local indie bookstores in the show notes for this show. Jack, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That'll do it for this week's episode. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. The theme music is by Dave Lefevre and Jake Lewis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts. and let others know about the show. You can also support the show by purchasing Jack's book from the link in the show notes and by signing up for a subscription to my newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. Talk to you soon.